Welcome to some Canadian content for a change. Uh, Keith, actually, I met Keith maybe about 4 years ago through another member, Lucy Yang, if he remembers her. Um, and I do believe another member of Keith's team from Digital Governance Council is Tim Buma. I think he spends most of his time with the Trust Registries group, I believe. Yeah, so in one way or another, Keith has had, I guess, a finger in what's been going on here lately. And what actually brought Keith top of mind to me was I saw a YouTube video where he presented in front of the House of Commons about digital governance. So it kind of piqued my
Very,
curiosity. So
very
I
nice.
reached out and he was gracious enough to accept, and here we are.
All right. Well, thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to join you. A couple of perhaps housekeeping pieces, just with respect to the agenda references the Digital Governance Council, and formally as the Standards Council of Canada. That should say CIO Strategy Council. Formerly, I was with and employed with the Standards Council of Canada, but just to note with respect to the agenda that the Digital Governance Council was once referred to as the CIO Strategy Council. Also, with respect to that kind introduction, Stephen, it was the Senate that I had the pleasure of speaking in front of, and certainly looking forward to the future with respect to also engaging with the House of Commons, albeit the House of Commons and the committees are a bit more feisty, I would say, than when you present in front of the sober second thought of the Senate. Um, with that, I will go ahead and get straight into things.
Just a note before you go straight into things, there's the corner of a window is in front of your slide called Digital Trust something with a little share. That's it. So I don't know. Yeah, just didn't want to block it. Thank you so much.
No worries at all. All right, so I'm here to talk about digital trust, interoperability, standards and approaches in Canada, and I want to focus centrally on a workshop that was convened in October of 2025. It was actually hosted by Senator Colin Deacon, and we had the pleasure of sitting in the Senate chamber to have this policy discussion between Canadian policymakers, experts, and industry leaders, as well as those from the European Union. The purpose of the workshop was to look to advance digital cooperation and mutual recognition following what occurred in 2025 around the EU-Canada summit that signaled to the political will on both sides in advancing some digital cooperation. As part of that workshop, it became quite clear that there is a shared belief between the European jurisdiction and with Canada that we are both striving toward common outcomes, whether it's around user centricity, privacy preserving technologies, secure access, recognizing that these are key for prosperity and democratic resilience. So just kind of setting the stage with respect to the workshop that was organized by the delegation of the European Union to Canada in close collaboration with the Digital Governance Council. In that workshop, we discussed at length a study on EU-Canada digital identity and trust services interoperability. I had the privilege and pleasure to be a co-author in that study, looking at how the European versus the Canadian model associated with or digital credentials and trust services, how they're defined and governed and managed, and ultimately with a lens to determine whether or not there's feasibility in having interoperable approaches between the jurisdictions with respect to the issuing of digital identities and trust services, digital identities, and verification, and so on and so forth. The study found, with my colleague in the EU, Alice Jonathan, that there was no insurmountable legal, technical, or conceptual barriers to interoperability. The study found that there was alignment. It did an analysis with respect to the UNCITRAL model law on identity and trust services. And with respect to the, I believe, 27 articles in that model law, when looked in contrast with the European approach to governing digital trust services, and in looking at Canada's, there was, again, like I said, no insurmountable barriers, and there was alignment with respect to this model law. Now, what was quite clear with respect to interoperability between the jurisdictions is that there is a strategic imperative here. And there was also recognition and acknowledgement within the workshop that when we talk about interoperability, many people simply think technical, like the technical interoperability between systems. But it's much more than that. Policy interoperability is just as important in order to set the appropriate controls that are necessary, and to shape things like the sovereignty, the economics, and the rights associated with the way in which systems then are controlled and interoperate together. There was also a commentary within that workshop around how empires once built railways and today they build algorithms, highlighting that in the current state there is geopolitical tensions that are very much causing concern, challenges, perhaps opportunities with respect to how countries are defining their own sovereign control and serving their economy. The key question, though, is not whether systems can interoperate. We heard quite regularly in the workshop that the technology is there. The question is really under whose laws, values, and governance in order to have, or in order to trust and ultimately have confidence in these systems. Now, the model in the EU, which many of you may be aware, is very much what I would refer to as top-down. It's a structured regulatory environment. You have the eIDAS for identity, you have an AI Act, you have a Digital Services Act, all of this setting the rules and governance associated to how Europe leverages, uses, and governs digital technologies. In Canada, and it is much more of a decentralized, pan-Canadian, given the Federation of Canada with the provinces and territories coupled with the federal government, a consensus-driven approach that's rooted in that federation. And so recognizing that different jurisdictions, like provincial jurisdiction, has certain accountabilities, authorities, and responsibilities and powers in comparison to the federal government. And when it comes to things like identity and credentials as to who I am, those of course cross those jurisdictions federally and provincially. Now, the workshop also emphasized with respect to these governance models, even though one is top-down and bottom-up, like I said earlier, with respect to the model law, the UN model law around digital identity and trust services, that those controls, when looked at with respect to the regulatory environment in the EU or the more consensus-driven policy approach in Canada, that there is alignment. And so given that alignment and toward those outcomes of, privacy preserving, interoperable approaches, the workshop participants very much emphasized reciprocity, transparency, and domestic accountability as foundational with respect to how Canada and the EU ultimately create for interoperability between their respective policies, as well as the technologies themselves. Now, that workshop also emphasized that we needed to take a use case driven approach. Coupled with that study that I mentioned earlier, really looking at pilots as an opportunity to have living laboratories for interoperability, to create the necessary market conditions in both jurisdictions to enable for this interoperability, but to also test and to, I would say, stress test the governance in order to have trust between jurisdictions. Some high value pilot areas that were discussed were everything from mobile driver's license, travel credentials, education, professional qualifications. At the end of the day, within that workshop, there was a convergence around B2B and workplace applications as being the least contentious and the most impactful early pilots, as it focuses on the business to business relationship in comparison to that with a citizen. And within the Canadian context, digital identity is quite polarized and quite contentious in that there are narratives and dialogues that suggest that digital identity does not, in fact, provide for privacy, that it would result in a surveillance state, and that the behaviors of Canadians would be attuned by, by government will, and the notion of chips installed in the back of your neck. So this perception, this negative connotation associated with digital identity in Canada certainly creates pause with respect to how you can instill digital trust and confidence within the public around the use of these technologies. Now, certainly I'm speaking to a group here that is very familiar with, understands, recognizes what digital identity is, and what it does, and that it actually preserves privacy, or in fact creates even more confidence with respect to the privacy of a person, in that you can have zero knowledge associated with I'm not showing my driver's license with all that information in order to purchase alcohol. I'm only providing whether I'm of the age of majority, so data minimization, these kinds of approaches to technology that can further preserve privacy. That all said, given the context in Canada, being different than that in Europe, where digital identity is literally listed in the eIDAS as, it's digital identity legislation, having legislation like that in Canada, with the public concerns associated, would never happen. Now, that all said, what also was recognized is that given the digital identity legislation and framework in Europe, driver's license aren't regarded as a form of identity. It's a privilege to drive a vehicle. In Canada, of course, we recognize driver's license as a form of identity. And what's important to recognize there is that in the context of having interoperability between these two jurisdictions, the recognition of a driver's license in that way in Europe is a foreign concept, given that that's not the way in which those cards are recognized. So in turn, again, looking at B2B as an opportunity to further establish pilots that can stress test the governance mechanism and ultimately the trust, but recognizing at the same time that there are areas in which there's a difference in how these two jurisdictions assure that a person is who they say they are. Now, when it comes to the mutual recognition and legal pathways, there is a call and was a call for a formal EU-Canada mutual recognition agreement grounded in that UN model law. Recognizing that both approaches, whether it's policy-driven in Canada, consensus-based, or top-down in the EU, that there is alignment with that to the model law. And the aim ultimately would be to recognize the legal effect of identity systems and trust services across these jurisdictions, meaning that if I'm issuing a credential in Canada, that it ultimately can be accepted as having the same legal effect in Europe as it does in Canada, and then vice versa. And by having this formal mutual recognition agreement coupled with the legal effects around the identity systems, we can provide legal certainty around the acceptance and of these credentials and electronic signatures that cross borders. Conformity assessment and assurance mapping was also a fundamental piece of the conversation, and again included in the study, that there is a need to recognize third-party evaluators across both regions. With respect to the technology, and as you look to conformity assessment in terms of having third-party, independent assessments and certifications associated with that technology, the management controls of an organization and certifying those with respect to establishing trust in the ecosystem and the way organizations are governing those technologies was a conversation and dialogue that also took place within the workshop and is articulated in the study around establishing common assurance mapping between Canada's national standard system of leveraging consensus-based national standards with certification and verification associated with those controls with that of the EU eIDAS, and that the conformity assessment could ensure transparency and regulatory confidence and public trust. So in turn, what this would mean in establishing mutual recognition of certificates that are issued in Canada or in the EU with respect to the way a technology is governed, used, and or used, that certificate would have acceptance within both regions. So in other words, I could certify in Canada or verify in Canada through an independent third party, and that would be accepted in Europe. Likewise, in Europe, you could do to the European model and have it accepted into Canada through a mutual recognition agreement that establishes the conformity assessment mechanisms and mapping to assure that trust. At the same time, though, as I mentioned, mutual recognition, we're recognizing the other jurisdiction's rule book. So in other words, Europe with eIDAS, any organization that effectively is in compliance and conformity with that through those rules, Canada would accept. And likewise, in the Canadian market, for organizations that are in compliance with the consensus-based policy standards within Canada and the certifications in relation, that Europe would accept it. That does challenge, in part, organizations that are looking to do business across borders, in that I would need to have Canadian organizations using European rules in order to have access to that market and vice versa. And so there was this core principle also established in the study and discussed during the workshop around functional equivalence. So it's one thing to have mutual recognition, but mutual recognition doesn't require identical systems, only equivalent assurance and reliability. So by applying functional equivalence, it can provide a practical alternative to regulatory harmonization. In other words, Europe can use their system, Canada can use their system, and we can recognize those systems and the results of those systems in order to have cross-border flow and trust with respect to credentials and trust services. What that also does is preserves the sovereignty of both jurisdictions, that I don't need to adjust my rule book in order to ensure that I continue to have access to your market, and vice versa for the other jurisdiction. And this principle effectively underpins the feasibility of achieving that Canada-EU mutual trust arrangement. Otherwise, we would need to fundamentally adjust our approaches to governance and the way in which we use technology in order to have access to a market like Europe and vice versa. And so in the workshop, and what was very clear and what resonated was the fact that technical trust in and of itself, so the interoperability between the systems itself, is insufficient. That there is a social trust that's essential, And certainly in the Canadian context, as I mentioned, with respect to the negative connotation, just using digital and identity as two words combined, that challenge in Canada. There are also concerns that were raised with respect to the misinformation and the narratives framing digital identity as that threat. And that success in the Canadian context, unlike the European one where it's mandatory, would require voluntary participation, transparency, audibility, and meaningful consent. There were international lessons and risks also discussed. The Kenya example was used as failed governance despite the technology. There was an emphasis around public engagement and democratic legitimacy of credentials, and that Canada's federated standards-based model is seen as inclusive and resilient as it is an open, transparent process where stakeholders can engage and the public can engage in the establishment of the rules that ultimately get codified. In terms of the policy and the technical and the legal alignment, so interoperability does require, as I mentioned earlier, it's not just a technical conversation, it is a policy one, it is a legislative one, standards and engagement. It requires simultaneous progress in these areas in order to achieve mutual recognition and equivalence. There was also, through this workshop, proposed creation of a joint Canada-EU working group that would focus on the legal and technical alignment, create for those conditions to establish the mutual recognition agreement, as well as the appropriate equivalence, and then that there would be shared middleware layer proposed around that functional equivalence, around the processes and the assurance, whether it's issuing a certificate or a verification statement associated to a technology or a business. What was also articulated in the workshop and as well in the study is that we're not starting from scratch. Canada and the EU already have a trusted trade relationship. We have the CETA trade agreement between Canada and the EU, and there is a protocol within the trade agreement that is around conformity assessment. That conformity assessment protocol already permits for a certificate to be issued primarily for physical goods like toys, to be recognized in the other person's jurisdiction using what's in your jurisdiction as the rule book. Now, what is being proposed is that we extend those physical goods to add digital credentials and trust services within that conformity assessment protocol, meaning that if I'm using a standard in Canada or using a standard in the EU or through its legislation, that conformity assessment with respect to a third party issuing a certificate or a verification statement, that it ultimately be accepted in the other jurisdiction. This would ground the digital trust framework in the way the architecture of trade and would also reduce compliance costs in that I don't need to certify against both rulebooks. And then it also extends the logic of that product equivalence that currently exists into the digital services domain. In terms of the actual technical collaboration required here in the priority areas is mapping assurance levels. So there's assurance levels in the EU, there's comparative ones in Canada. There needs to be a crosswalk between those in order to establish what levels of assurance and trust are necessary for having the acceptance of credentials and the use of trust services. There's also a recognition that there needs to be an approach to technical collaboration that maintains continuous updates as technologies evolve and the risk landscape changes. That risk can be technical, that risk can also be geopolitical. And then also recognizing that there needs to be a shared operational pathway for validation, credential exchange, and verification based on ISO 17029 methodology. So in large respects, with respect to pilots that have occurred in Canada, even within the EU, it largely recognizes the conformity assessment schemes of 17025. 17025 of ISO and IEC focuses primarily on goods and services, and it is referred primarily as product certification, whereas 17029 focuses on validation and verification, which could look at goods and services, but it can also look at an organization's controls. and its management, and issuing a statement of verification. Because one thing that's very clear with respect to product certification, when you look at your toaster and you see that mark of conformity, it doesn't say much, right? It's a physical product. You see this mark. There's some, perhaps some people naive as to what it means, but it looks like it's been checked. In the digital context where there's a lower level of trust in relation to these technologies, there needs to be a more informative way to the public to indicate what that mark means. And so 17029 issues statements of verification. Those statements of verification verify digital claims that an organization makes with respect to its controls, with respect to the way in which it governs its technology and manages them, with how they use them. And that information can be extremely important to be able to address misinformation, disinformation in the market, and also serve as a tool to instill confidence and trust beyond what a mark of conformity can do in 17065, given that in the digital context, quite frankly, we don't see it. That infrastructure is not, I can't hold it in my hand necessarily. So next steps and immediate opportunities, I'll leave you with this, is that there needs to be shared communication framework recommended using clear neutral language between Europe and Canada. I already talked about one of those areas that's a touchy topic, which is digital identity. The fact that that's a common term used in legislation in Europe and common in Europe as a mandatory thing, and in Canada not. Being able to reconcile that communication is going to be important to instill trust and confidence in the Canadian market. Engagement also needs to remain voluntary and transparent, privacy protective, so that citizens effectively have agency to choose whether or not they want to participate in such an ecosystem. And that finally, the political dialogue was encouraged at the workshop around the G7 Digital Ministerial and the future EU-Canada agreements. I'm pleased to say that come last December, the G7 Digital Ministerial met, as well as the Canada-EU Digital Partnership. They had their inaugural council meeting and a joint statement coupled with a memorandum of understanding between Canada and the EU have been signed around digital credentials and trust services. A cooperative agreement in order to further advance and deepen the cooperation in this area. And it provides for a framework of cooperation for the two jurisdictions to establish the legal effects and recognition between the identity systems and trust services in both jurisdictions. It provides a cooperative a framework in order to advance the various elements that I described in this presentation around achieving mutual recognition. Will we still need more than just a cooperative agreement between Canada and the EU? Absolutely. We need to further extend or expand on our existing CETA trade agreement for mutual recognition. We also need to establish an equivalency agreement to preserve or safeguard our sovereignty and to ensure that the rules in Canada effectively are trusted in their form in the European context, that we can continue to access that market and scale our Canadian companies globally. And finally, with that, having a joint task force that is doing much of this work to establish the technical collaboration, as well as looking at the legal effects and legal considerations in doing so. I will leave things there and ask for any questions, comments, and or feedback.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. That was really interesting. Stephen, we'll start with you.
Great presentation, very interesting. Thank you. The B2B and workplace pilots that they identified as being like the most likely to succeed, is the linchpin for that is getting Canadians in those workplaces and B2B environments to accept digital identity? Because on the other side of the pond, they're not going to trust that the person that said or evaluated or assessed the credential is going to be an actual person or someone with the right credentials, right? So I guess on their side, they embrace digital identification, like you said. And if us Canucks don't, won't that be the straw that breaks the back, so to speak?
Right. So in uh, one of the principal use cases was professional qualifications. So consider the fact that Canada needs more doctors, or we have a number of doctors that are already here that aren't recognized. Um, there is opportunity through this, where this becomes less of a conversation about digital identity and more of a conversation in Canada around having doctors available. And so, in that regard, how do we recognize the credentials of these individuals and qualifications is where you can leverage digital identity credential systems in order to do so. So it's changing the narrative, I would say, with respect to what we're aiming to achieve. In this case, my example, ensuring that all Canadians have access to a family doctor, as an example, recognizing that the barrier is in large reason in that the qualifications aren't recognized. And is there a potential way through these kinds of mutual recognition agreements in order to use the technology to be able to issue such a certificate and to recognize that credential, to verify it, and ultimately have it accepted. Again, like I said, it requires the legal effects of the identity systems to be recognized in both countries in order to do that. We have also in Canada a challenge with respect to internal trade, just with respect to those professional qualifications being recognized across different provinces. So it actually creates a real opportunity for Canada to both address from a pan-Canadian perspective, but as well an international one. So I would say that yes, there certainly is a challenge with respect to the use of digital identity, but if we're talking about people's professional qualifications and what we use in order to recognize and verify that, that's a different narrative that I think will go a longer way for Canadians to be able to accept these methodologies or these approaches to verify somebody's credentials.
Thanks.
I was just wondering if you were familiar with, in Canada, we have a digital identity project in BC Gov for BC Mines. I was just wondering if you know that story. It seems like they have also, rather than doing the digital identities of people, rather the digital identities of people in professional roles in order to certify, oh, I have audited this document and this is my signature and stuff like that. So the opportunity for Canada is similar to, as you say, about not tying it so much to personhoods, like individuals interacting with the government, which is can be uh, contentious here in Canada, I agree, but about roles. Are there other examples in Canada that you're aware of, like BC Mines, that we could leverage?
Yeah, so I would say Canada has pockets of excellence in the area. You name one, an area that I'm spending a lot of time, given that I'm a provincially appointed member of the Ontario Health Data Council, has a lot to do with healthcare, and that's why that's the first thing that popped to my mind. But I'm sure, just given even within the workshop, things that were described, like pilot licenses were also
Mm.
described because that's something that goes across borders and is a potential uh, ripe use case to be able to serve to stress test and ultimately provide for those conditions for mutual recognition. So there certainly are others. The question really becomes as to whether or not this is a pan-Canadian international initiative, or is this a pan-Canadian one and separately a Canada international one, because the jurisdictions and the authorities and powers, there are certain things the federal government like with respect to citizenship, um, and then you have provinces with respect to birth certificates. Like those are the core foundational identity documents. Everything then is derived from those. So again, it really becomes a question as to the use case. Now, I know with respect to provinces and territories that they're very much looking for people to fill jobs and to recognize credentials. There also are federal programs around that, so it could very much be a pan-Canadian international use case that brings provinces and feds together. But all the use cases don't necessarily need that pan-Canadian approach because it is only within federal jurisdiction, like pilot licenses. Or perhaps it's only in provincial with respect to delivery of healthcare services. So as we define what these and identify the B2B and kind of having those low hanging, um, least contentious use cases, we just need to be mindful as to who needs to be in the room, and where those authorities rest, and not to conflate it more than it needs to be, so that we actually get real traction on the ground.
Great. Neil.
Yeah, one of the things that, of course, in the digital world, everybody's doing stuff together, so there's lots of crosstalk. I'm co-chair on a diff. I'm Canadian here in Ottawa, sharing the same weather. And one of the things that we're looking at, and I notice you've got that prominently, everybody does, is a travel use case. So one of the things we've been looking at in depth is looking at a travel profile, a secure digital travel profile, such that one of the conundrums there is if you want personalized services, you have to share a lot of personal data. So how do you protect in that environment? So we've got some models we've been looking at in terms of, sharing, purposeful sharing for a very short period of time, which overlaps with, for example, facial recognition pilots. You're getting a photograph or you're getting assessed either at your desk before go to the airport or at the airport. And they're using your face as a passport throughout the entire journey. You don't have to do that again, with the proviso that that information is guaranteed to be deleted, and you get a notification 36 hours after your flight leaves that, in fact, that information has been deleted. Is that part of the data privacy trust kind of problem laid bare?
Well, it's the travel use cases are interesting because when it comes to pilots and their credentials, there seems to
Mm-hmm.
be less contention than when you're talking about people going through border services to travel on vacation. Um, and certainly we've seen it within the Canadian context with individuals that have traveled to other countries, including the US, where uh, they're not quite happy. And even coming back to Canada and the types of technologies that are being used by our border services also putting into question. So I would say, as much as these are areas that private industry and governments are looking at, I don't think they're the ones that you would want to prioritize in the context of establishing trust between Europe and Canada. Because as soon as you bring in that fold, well, now you're going to have political actors and that will dissipate. So it's important to get some of those early wins, least contentious areas to establish a level of trust. And if you focus on the business, if I'm doing something for business versus personal, there seems to be less personal issue or distrust in having that interaction than when it is personal. So I guess all I would say and all I would advise on is just, you know, um, being mindful that those are contentious areas. Now in the EU, probably least less contentious altogether, just by way of the way their framework works. But in terms of advancing digital cooperation between Canada and the EU and having trust and confidence with Canadians, the B2B is more conducive to expanding that relationship, at least for now.
Yep. Thanks.
Speaking of the B2B relationship, Carla, maybe I don't know if she could speak about are you familiar with the VLEI ecosystem? The legal entity identifiers that are being granted to different organizations, and gosh, I'm gonna muck it up, but like in the EU, it's starting to be used in order to do regulatory submissions for banking, for example. That then you would use digital signatures that are associated with the VLEI, the verifiable legal entity identifier, and be able to do those kinds of regulatory submissions. So perhaps that might be a low contentious target, and it's also currently being integrated into the European banking regulations, for example. Are you familiar with that, or?
So, yeah, so spot on. It's a good example. It's also one that has come up in my circles with respect to just businesses and their identification and access to then services for from a business perspective. So I would say yes, I'm familiar with the approaches and the how, um, to be further formulated and discussed to instill, trust and confidence. But I think in the Canadian context, like that's an area that needs to be addressed in general. The fact that it's happening in other parts of the world, Canada likes to look to other parts of the world in order to move. I would hope in the future we would be much more proactive in establishing our own basis for things. But you're spot on an area that would be least contentious.
Right. Okay. And within Trust over IP, then we do have connections then through Carla and the Carey Foundation, which is also the underpinnings of the technology for that. In fact, that specification just got passed yesterday. And also that same technology. Speaking of, I saw you had a slide about MDLs that Utah is implementing um, that tech, but they're also using the carrier specifications as well in order to try to have like avoiding like the no phone home and stuff, which is what is increasing distrust in digital identification in the first place. So
Yeah, that's why I said like this is as much as tech can try to solve for tech problems,
yeah,
this is a governance issue.
yeah,
This is how we're managing things and the decisions that are being made associated. So how can I trust you as a person? How can I trust you as an organization that you have the best interest or my best interest? So as much as we can continue to use technology to try and solve for technology problems, that
hmm,
doesn't go far enough.
yeah. Do you have do you have ideas on or models or whatever on how to increase trust from through regulation or because I know within trust over IP we have the concepts that regulatory trust is reflected, for example, in the technologies of trust lists so that you can reference them in order to identify, these people have met these conformance assessments, etc. Is there any discussion like that within the Canadian context or recognition in the international context? UN is working on some stuff, but yeah, what are your opinions on these kinds of governance reflected?
Yeah, I think a lot underpins on transparency and openness. Like how decisions are made, how the technology is used, how the technology works, and those can be expressed through different approaches on being able to provide for that transparency, whether it is a trust registry or these kinds of things. I think they're components to I call it like it's a tool in the toolbox. As much as Europe has gone the route of top-down regulatory kind of first and that's caused its own issues too with respect to the market and marketplace behaviors. So it's not to say that you should put all your eggs into one policy instrument or one approach. I think there's a need to recognize that you need different tools in that toolbox in order to build a house. I'm not going to use a hammer to screw in and to screw in a screw, or I'm not going to use a screwdriver to hammer in a nail. Like, but at times I find that our policy orientation seems to gravitate toward one instrument or a select few instruments. And it doesn't address the full continuum to which you instill that public trust and confidence. And in part, that's why we're seeing a digital trust deficit. Like we have rules for the road, we have rules for building houses and these types of things. There's inherent trust. People are walking into their homes, not giving a second thought. I'm putting toast in my toaster. I'm not feeling as though it's going to burst into flames. Like there's a governance there that has been established over the years. The internet was created not with that thinking in mind as to when it was scaled in the way in which it's now propagated into society and the types of technologies and uses that are there. And now we're trying to rein that in. Europe's trying to rein it in very much from a regulatory point of view, and it's bugging a lot of people in industry. Not to say it's not the right thing to do, but we need to be comprehensive in our approaches and recognizing that in large respects we let the cat out of the barn, and or we've opened Pandora's box. We can't put it all back in. Like we got to we have some work to do, and unfortunately technology solving for technology problems is not the only answer or the sole
Right,
answer.
right. Okay. There's on your point of policy levers or different types of policy hammers that are available. I'm interested to be following the work within Trust over IP of these decentralized trust graphs because that kind of reflects not an official standardized way by which we trust, but through a network of recommendations. And the stronger that network becomes, then that becomes our the greater our trust in that. And so anyway, at Trust over IP, they're trying to digitize that ability. So I'm going to be interested to see how that follows in the future for as perhaps another policy lever for digital trust.
Amazing, amazing,
So
amazing.
excellent. Are there any other questions from our audience? Lynn.
Hi, thanks very much, Keith. This has been really informative. I'm just wondering if you see any opportunity or potential for bringing wider community in on this. We were talking about governance being the key focus here. And how can we bring the general public or society in to support what we're trying to achieve here?
Yeah, a great question. And what I'd start with is saying public consultation is not enough. The level of engagement, it really needs to be a collaborative piece. I mentioned in the presentation this notion of establishing joint task forces and that's not just to say bring policymakers and technical experts in the room. It needs to bring the public, civil society, to be able to create for the necessary controls to instill that level of trust. Because again, it comes down to transparency and openness. If you're building in a vacuum, whether it's the technology, the policy, the governance, the acceptance is not going to be there. Or you're going to come up to a hard realization. So I think if anything, the advice I'm providing, both public and private sector, is that transparency and that willingness to collaborate in a form that it creates those necessary conditions for trust. Um, can't do these things in a vacuum. So
Yeah,
I would hope as a task force is
Hmm.
designed in relation to this MOU that's been struck between Canada and the EU, that folks like yourselves would have an invitation to engage in those discussions just as much as the public and any other policymaker in that makeup. I'm not the one that gets to decide, but fingers crossed. My hope is that that is what will occur.
Yeah, and two, I think it's like your toast example. There's the literacy issue here, just the awareness or mindfulness, as you mentioned.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Keith? Oh, sorry. Neil.
Whatever. So yeah, as you can imagine, this is an ecosystem and governance group. We've been working on this for quite some time at Trust IP. I'm also part of a group that there's a few of us here today, governance architecture. So we're looking at what is the technical and how does the technical work with the governance, right? So we're having a lot of discussions on that. So we've got actually just one of the members who's in Australia right now, and he is on the UN FACT committee on trust registries in a UN. So we've got a lot of expertise in here. So I guess the question, especially for us Canadians on the call, are there some opportunities that you would see we should keep an eye out for expertise that you may be looking for?
Yeah, so what I would say is that don't let technology define governance. That governance should be defining how technology behaves. Unfortunately, we're living in a system where technology, in many ways, is actually establishing the governance, and we're participants in that, whether we like it or not. We didn't make those decisions. It's just the way in which we have to operate in society. So in terms of the expertise, as you look to governance experts toward this, I would say very much there is a need for that expertise in these global discussions and ultimately helping to create the necessary frameworks to govern whether it's the technology, the people, or the process. And as much as, in my presentation speaking to Canada and the EU, I know that there's joint partnerships that the EU has established with Japan and other parts of the world. And I know there is a look to having all those countries engaged in discussion around digital cooperation and further expanding those partnerships. So I think there's certainly an opportunity for those that aren't from Canada or aren't from Europe on this call. I would certainly say that there is opportunity and certainly a willingness, at least on my side, that those expertise from other countries do engage in those discussions, even though their country may not be mentioned in it, because there is certainly a willingness and a diversification of trade at the moment, given the geopolitical tensions, that those conversations need to be had.
Fantastic. Thank you. And we're at the hour. So if there isn't somebody who wants to squeeze in a last minute question, I will close the meeting. And thank you very much for a very excellent presentation. I'm going to be working on the editing and getting that up onto YouTube so that we can share that and promote it as well. Thank you very much, Keith, for coming to speak with us today.
Well, thank you again for the invitation. And if you have any questions, comments, want to engage in any of this work, certainly I'm an email away.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks
Bye,
very much.
everyone. We'll see you in 2 weeks.